Energy is the ability to do work. Welcome to Techo Tuesdays, where I try to teach you about certain technologies that we use on a daily basis that we perhaps take for granted, but I think would be nice if we actually understood them. Today we're going to be talking about electricity, which is quite an interesting subject in the in the context of South Africa because we're just having a very emotional challenge with electricity right now. But so I thought it was fitting that I at least try to get people to understand what electricity is, so they can understand a bit better if we're actually really struggling technically with this thing, or if it's just us deciding to sabotage things. So I tried to look for the definition of electricity, and I wasn't quite happy with it because it uses the word electric in it, and I just feel like you shouldn't be using a word to define a word. The definition I found was energy. No, sorry. Electricity is the flow of electric power or charge. Again, why are you using the word electric in there? But anyway, we have to move on. It's not something new. Electricity has been around pretty much forever. It is in some way natural. We just had to find a way of generating it and creating it in a more usable way for us to be able to use it in our homes, in our appliances, and so on. So electricity can be found in nature. You can find it in the clouds in the form of lightning. Every time you see lightning, that is a bolt of electricity that is flowing through the air. It has existed in nature. There are fish even now who can give you an electric charge. When you rub your hands and you hold a piece of paper, it lifts up. That's an electric charge in between there. Sometimes you're wearing wool and you see some sparks. That's something to do with electricity. Sometimes you walk on a mat or a rug or a carpet and you touch something and it gives you an electric shock. That there's electricity. These are things that have existed for a long time. They've always been there. We just hadn't found a way or understood how we can then use them. To be fair, we didn't really have a use for them until now. We really have a wide use for electricity, so much so that some people really deem it to be an essential part of life, so essential that it might be compared to nourishment. I've actually spoken to a guy who has compared it to nourishment. In fact, he went so far as to say that it is more important than nourishment. I disagree, of course, but that is the world we live in now. Again, it's been around for a long time. The Egyptians knew about it as far as 2750 BCE. They've made recordings of it, especially of recordings of those fish that I'm talking about. They observed them in nature in the Nile, and they knew that electricity existed, but they didn't quite think that it was something that could be used in everyday life. And we only started to sort of understand it and started to do experiments and started to make strides in electricity studies in the late 18th century, where we started to try to understand this thing, and we started to see that, we can actually apply it to everyday lives. We can actually implement it in certain things and certain industries, and it can actually help to make life better for us. So electricity as we know it now, by the way, I don't know what I'm talking about. So as far as I could find out, the way that electricity is now is that I could find two methods in which we can create or generate electricity. Actually, not create, it's generate. There's using a certain form of energy to create energy in the form of electricity. So what I found was there is the photovoltaic principle, and there's the electromagnetic principle. Let me talk about the photovoltaic principle first. That is what solar panels use. As you can probably see, these here behind me over there, even on top of me and over there, these are solar panels. So what these do is they absorb light from the sun, and in them lies material that has electrons that are excited by the sun. So when the sun's light is absorbed by this material, the electrons in there are excited. And remember, the definition of electricity is the flow of an electric charge or of electric power. So these excited electrons now flow through a conductor, and that flow of this charge is therefore the induction of electricity, or the generation of electricity. Very simple, yet quite complicated. It is very inefficient. The amount of sunlight that goes in there in comparison to the amount of electric energy that you get out is there's a huge difference. There's a lot of sun that you get, but you get little electricity from it. So we're still trying to make it more efficient so that we can be able to harness more energy from this process. Then I'll talk about the electromagnetic principle, which is what we mostly use to generate electricity in the world. This then works on the principle that if you move a conductor or a bunch of conductors structured in a certain way through a magnetic field or around a magnet. So a magnetic field is a space around a magnet where the power of the magnet is felt. If you've noticed when you've played with magnets, there's a certain distance where nothing happens, and then there's a certain distance where things start to happen. They're able to come together. That's the field of that's the magnetic field, and outside of that, there's no magnetic field. It only goes for a certain space, around you. You can think of it as if you stink or if you smell good, positive or negative charge, it won't be felt everywhere in the world. It's only going to be felt to a certain radius around you. So if someone is close to you, they can smell your magnetic field. So if you move a conductor within this magnetic field, what you get is electricity flowing through this conductor. So once we understood that, our mission was then now to package this in a way that if we are able to make this move or rotate in this, because rotation allows you to have a continuous movement, continuous and constant movement, which then allows you to induce a continuous and a constant or consistent charge of electricity through your conductor. So if we're able to figure that out, we can then produce a steady supply of electricity. So how then do we do this? That is where now you have your windmills coming in, your wind turbines, your hydroelectric power. These, I guess they are hydro as well, but these wheels that you put in a river and then the river causes them to spin. So these things that spin, these mechanisms that spin, are attached to a bundle or a roll of conductors, which moves through a magnetic field, which then allows you to induce electricity through this conductor. So that's pretty much the simplicity of it. When you see a wind turbine, there's not too much magic happening in there. Essentially, when that thing is spinning, that is all we needed to do to spin, so that it spins the conductor, which spins through a magnetic field, and then we have electricity generated that way. The same thing kind of happens with that water wheel thing that I spoke about. It's rarely used these days. We'd rather use different methods because it's not very efficient, by my understanding. But essentially, that is what that did. And then you can also use turbines, which is what they use in hydroelectric dams. So you have water that is high up there, but it's going to flow down from the reservoir to the lower part of the dam. So you want to have a turbine there, so when the water comes in, it gets in and is channeled to move in a circle and then spin the turbine, which is attached to this conductor, which will then spin in the magnetic field and therefore generate electricity. But essentially, all of it is about, most of it, as well, all of it in the electromagnetic field space is centered around creating a spinning motion within an electric field, and that thereby generates electricity. So then, how then does burning coal, burning nuclear power, or burning diesel or whatever allow us to generate electricity? Well, what that does is, because what we need is the spinning motion, we realize that, okay, if you look at steam, or maybe if you're cooking food or you're boiling water, if you look at the steam rushing out of the lid or whatever, you'll see that it's going fast, which means you have this energy that exists in boiling water. So we were like, okay, so if we can harness this energy and channel it through a conduit that we can then make a turbine spin, that would be great. And that is where now we came up with burning stuff, or power generators that we see everywhere in the world today. You burn coal, it boils water, the water becomes steam, and you pressurize it, you put it in a sealed container, and it travels through certain pipes where it gets to the turbine and spins around. It spins the turbine around, which then again spins the conductor within the magnetic field and therefore induces the electricity. And that's essentially what we're doing when we're doing it in nuclear. There's the nuclear fusion or fission process produces heat, and that heat can then be used to boil water, which will then create steam, which will then go to turn the turbine. One thing I must say is that with this method, you do have a lot of water usage because the water is transformed, is evaporated from liquid to gas, but then you don't have all of it being reused. So you do use up a lot of water with these, which is something that is rarely talked about, but I'm not going to talk about much either. So that is essentially how you generate electricity with that. You also have generators, which we're probably getting used to now in South Africa, with a lot of people turning to generators whenever there is no power. And what those do is there's a sort of like an engine type thing taking place there. An engine is, you have a piston that is being caused to move by an explosion here that is induced by a spark plug, and a mixture of fuel and air explodes, and then it moves the piston down, and when that moves up and down, this is able to induce a rotational movement the same way that your pedals, your feet are just moving pretty much up and down, but your pedals are able to turn that movement into circular motion. And then again, that circular motion is what is used to turn the conductor through the magnetic field, which then induces the electricity. So I hope I've been able to explain that quite well, so that you're able to understand it. In the context of South Africa, well, actually, I think most, if not all of the world works like this. We have a grid. So we can think of the grid as a spider web. A spider builds its web with certain strongholds or certain pillars. It's gonna hook up at that corner, 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 and then in here it's going to build an intricate web. That is sort of how our grid is. And if you think about it, you can think of the power stations as these pillars. Now, these pillars all supply stability in the context of the spider web, all supply stability to the spider web. In that sense, all these power stations all supply electricity to the whole grid. Now, I'm in Kempton Park. There's a power station here called Kelvin Power Station. I cannot say that the electricity that I'm using here comes from Kelvin Power Station, because essentially the electricity that is produced anywhere within South Africa goes into the grid, and it spreads around, just goes around the grid. So we then just hook up to the grid and get our share of electricity. You can't specifically say where it comes from, because all of it is just fed in there, and then that is just harnessed, or we're just connected to it, to various points on the spider web of electricity. So these generation plants transmit electricity into the grid, and that's the transmission line. And then we have substations which transform the energy of the electricity to a more usable form of electricity that we can then use in our homes. Because remember, when it's generated at the power station, it is very high voltage, it's very high current. So then you have an HV plant which then transforms it into a transportable form, because there's a lot of losses in here in the grid, so you want to make it high voltage so as to reduce your losses. And then when it's around the grid, you have high voltage electricity, and that's why you go around and you see these big towers of electricity. It's not the one that you'll see next to your house, because the one next to your house, it has been stepped down, it's much usable, much safer. The one that you see with the big, oh, that's a nice car, with the big towers, that's a lot of electricity. It's very, very dangerous. That will just kill you instantly. So you have that, the grid with a high voltage electricity, and then that is at another substation transformed to be a usable voltage, which then can go into your house and you can use it for appliances without them exploding. One other thing I'd just like to talk about quickly is energy storage. One big issue that we have with electricity in the world, especially trying to transition to greener forms of electricity production, is energy storage. we're able to create electricity. So the reason why coal and nuclear and such are much more desirable is because you can burn coal any time of the day. You can have a nuclear reaction any time of the day. Yeah, sure, I guess with water you can have the dam has water pretty much any time of the day. The problem is the dam only has water any time of the day where it is, and it doesn't have it in certain places. Like we in South Africa don't really have water sources huge enough to provide a substantial and worthwhile amount of electricity for us. And I stand to be corrected. Remember, I do not know what I'm talking about. So the issue that we have is that if you go to look at solar, for example, out of the 525,600 minutes that you have in a year, how many of those do you actually have sunshine? Out of the 525,600 minutes we have in a year, and how many of those do you actually have wind blowing for wind turbines? And those are the issues that we have, that in between that, those gaps in between, how do we then store the energy so that we are able to use it when the sun isn't shining, when the wind isn't blowing? And that's what scares us from moving to greener methods of generating electricity. Of course, there's the political and the financial reasons, but essentially that is one big weapon that they are using as to why we cannot move to there. And that's a big issue, because even with electric cars, the range of it is still quite limited, mainly because in order for you to travel far, you need a big battery. So we need to figure out how to travel the same distance or even more with a much smaller battery. And we might think that, yeah, we've been making batteries for a long time, we know how they work, we're great at them, but like we're far from it. Even the batteries we have on our phones, they're actually still too big for what they are, for what they produce. Yes, it's pretty respectable now, but like it's still quite big. So we still need to figure out the energy density thing and solve energy density in batteries in order to have energy storage at a large scale be viable, in order to have electric flight be viable, in order to have electric vehicles be more desirable. And I think I've covered pretty much everything I was interested in talking about with regards to electricity. I hope that I've made it make more sense. Remember, it's mainly about spinning a conductor or a wire within a magnetic field. And when you do that, you're going to have electricity in here. Again, I don't know what I'm talking about, so you might want to go and look at this, maybe watch other videos from other people, read a few books, educate yourself, become more knowledgeable. Knowledgeable sounds wrong, but I think that's the correct word about your world and how it works. This was Techo Tuesdays. Thank you for tuning in.